In 1941, Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union. Known as Operation Barbarossa, it was the largest military attack in history. In reality, it failed due to a combination of poor planning, brutal winters, and the Soviet Army's fierce resistance. But in this alternate timeline, things unfold very differently. Hitler listens to his top generals, abandoning his reckless ideas. The German army focuses everything on capturing Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union. This change in strategy alters history forever. The attack is swift and overwhelming. Soviet forces try to resist, but the German military is too strong. By the end of 1941, Moscow falls. The city is left in ruins, and chaos spreads across the Soviet Union. With their capital lost and their government in shambles, the Soviet people are left leaderless. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, is removed from power by his own generals in a desperate coup. Within months, the new Soviet leadership surrenders. In 1942, the Treaty of Smolensk is signed, giving Germany control over vast areas of Soviet territory. Ukraine, the Baltic states, and the oil-rich Caucasus become part of the Nazi Empire. Germany now has access to resources it desperately needed. Oil from the Caucasus powers its tanks and planes. Farmland in Ukraine feeds its soldiers and people. Factories in conquered territories build weapons. The collapse of the Soviet Union marks a turning point, allowing Germany to focus its power elsewhere. With the Soviet Union out of the war, Britain becomes Germany's main target. For years, Britain had held on through sheer determination. Its navy and air force fought bravely, but without help from allies, the island nation's resources begin to run out. German submarines block supply routes, cutting off food and fuel. Cities are bombed day and night, leaving people exhausted and terrified. Famine spreads and morale collapses. By 1944, Britain surrenders. A new government loyal to Germany takes control, promising peace and stability. Nazi flags fly in London, and British citizens are forced to accept German soldiers on their soil. The royal family flees to Canada, and Winston Churchill resigns in disgrace. Germany now controls nearly all of Europe. The countries under its rule are no longer free. People live in fear, forced to follow Nazi laws. Those who resist are arrested, tortured, or killed. Eastern Europe suffers the most. The Nazis turn the region into a massive labor camp. Millions of people, including Jews, Slavs, and political prisoners, are killed or enslaved. Villages are destroyed, and the survivors are either deported or used as forced labor. German settlers move into these areas, taking over the land and resources. For those living under Nazi rule, life becomes a nightmare. While Germany takes over Europe, Japan solidifies its dominance in Asia. With the Soviet Union no longer a threat, Japan focuses on expanding its empire. China, already weakened by years of war, falls completely under Japanese control. The Japanese military crushes any remaining resistance, killing millions and enslaving entire populations. Factories in China are used to produce weapons, and its farmland feeds Japan's growing empire. In Southeast Asia, Japan takes over countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. These regions are rich in resources, including rubber, oil, and metals, all of which Japan uses to fuel its military and economy. The Japanese Empire becomes the most powerful force in Asia, ruling with an iron fist. Any attempts at rebellion are met with brutal crackdowns. Entire villages are wiped out to send a message: resistance will not be tolerated. Japan also dominates the Pacific Ocean. Its navy expands its reach, isolating Australia and threatening the remaining Allied forces in the region. By 1945, Japan controls almost all of Asia and the Pacific. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, as Japan calls it, is nothing more than a tool for exploitation. The people in these territories live under harsh military rule, forced to work for their Japanese overlords. With Britain and the Soviet Union defeated, the United States finds itself alone. President Franklin D. Roosevelt faces a difficult decision. The American people, weary of war, demand peace. Without allies in Europe or Asia, the U.S. has little hope of defeating the Axis powers. By 1945, the United States signs peace treaties with both Germany and Japan. It retreats into isolation, focusing on protecting its own borders. Inside the U.S., opinions are divided. Some Americans support the peace, arguing that the country should focus on itself. Others, including veterans and political leaders, feel ashamed for abandoning Europe and Asia. Far-right groups in the US begin to admire the ideas of Germany and Japan, pushing for similar policies at home. The country becomes deeply divided, struggling to find its place in this new world. In the territories ruled by Germany and Japan, life is bleak. Freedom, as people once knew it, is gone. In Germany's empire, the government controls every part of life. Art, literature, and music are strictly monitored. Only works that glorify the Nazis are allowed. Schools teach children to obey the government and hate anyone who is different. People who speak out against the government are silenced. Many are sent to prison camps, never to be seen again. Eastern Europe is turned into a nightmare. Millions are killed in mass executions or worked to death in labor camps. German settlers take over the land, pushing out the native populations. Cities are destroyed, and entire cultures are erased. The Nazis' goal is clear: to create a world where only their vision of superior people remain. In Japan's empire, life is no better. Farmers, factory workers, and entire communities are forced to produce food and weapons for the Japanese military. Any resistance is met with extreme violence. People live in constant fear, knowing that even small acts of defiance could lead to death. The Japanese government enforces strict control over every aspect of life, from what people can say to what they can eat. At first, Germany and Japan work together to dominate the world, but by the 1950s, their alliance begins to fall apart. Both empires want control over the Middle East, a region rich in oil. This causes tension between them. Ideological differences also create conflict. Germany's racial policies, which consider Asians as inferior, offend Japan. The Japanese refuse to be treated as second-class citizens by their supposed allies. A new Cold War begins, this time between Germany and Japan. Both sides develop nuclear weapons, preparing for the possibility of another war. The world becomes even more dangerous, with the threat of nuclear destruction hanging over everyone. In this alternate history, life is dark and full of fear. Without freedom and democracy, progress is stifled. Resistance movements form in secret, but they are small and powerless compared to the massive armies of Germany and Japan. People around the world live under harsh and oppressive governments, with no hope of escape. This vision of a Nazi and Japanese-controlled world is a terrifying reminder of what could have happened if the Allies had lost. It shows how fragile history is and how much was at stake during World War II. In this alternate reality, the world is locked in endless conflict, oppression, and suffering, a grim warning of how different our lives might have been. This alternate history reveals a terrifying world of oppression under Nazi and Japanese rule, reminding us of the sacrifices made for freedom and democracy. Let's never take these hard-won freedoms for granted. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe and like for more thought-provoking content. Your support keeps these stories alive.